It's 1600 CET. Let's start. Hello once again from the Deutsche Welle Academy in Berlin, and thank you very much for joining us in the final live session in our Digital Safety for Journalists series. My name is Guy Deegan, and I'm your host for this workshop. In this session, we're going to look closely at the threat of cyber attacks and hacking that journalists might face, and what journalists can do to avoid these attacks and stay safe online. And joining us from San Francisco to talk about that is Morgan Marquis-Boire, a security expert, ex-hacker, and he's also working for Google. Hi, Morgan. Good morning to you.
Yeah, hi Guy. Good afternoon.
Welcome, and thank you very much for getting up so early to speak with us.
I enjoy doing the whole cross-continental thing. It means you get a bright and early start to the day.
We very much appreciate you taking time at this hour to speak with us. Morgan is 9 hours behind us in Berlin, so it's just after 7 a.m. for him. And as you can see, yes, he's got a cup of coffee there to hand. So I'm hoping that's perking you up. Welcome to everyone. We see the training room is starting to fill up, and that's great on a Friday afternoon. But before we begin our talk with Morgan, for any newcomers, just let me point out an important feature of the Adobe Connect online training room. Underneath the video window, you'll see that we have a chat room, and that's where you can ask questions to Morgan, or ask questions between yourselves, make comments and suggestions, post links, for example. And you'll also see our colleagues Stefan and Thomas from the DW Academy, who will be also quite active on the chat room. If you're on Twitter, don't forget our Twitter handle is @DW_Academy, and the workshop hashtag is DigiSafe. So if you're following the conversation on Twitter, please use the DigiSafe hashtag. Morgan, I might just ask you to also, if you could type in the chat room what your Twitter handle is as well, so people can possibly follow you and include you in on that conversation. While Morgan's doing that, I'll explain that we have up to an hour for this workshop, and the format is quite similar to what we've been doing earlier in the week. Morgan's going to explain to us a little bit more about what sort of attacks or the threat of hacks that journalists can fall victim to, and he also has some real-life examples to show us. And where possible, we always appreciate questions from you, and we'll take questions whenever we can. So, Morgan, are you ready to start?
Yeah, I think so. As much as one can be at this outrageously early hour.
We're waiting for that caffeine to kick in. Can I ask you by putting this question to you? You're a security expert, and perhaps as an observer of our trade, our profession of journalism, or media organizations, do you think journalists firstly take digital safety seriously enough?
I think that the sort of prevailing engagement with digital security by the journalist community is definitely it's improved a lot over the last few years, and I think there's been sort of that corollary improvement with rising awareness of the threats that are out there and the risks that people face digitally as journalists. I think that, I mean, the way you phrase the question does imply a certain amount of judgment, in that, I'm not sure if the journalist community is taking it seriously enough. However, having said that, the security of journalists isn't necessarily something that the security community has spent like a lot of time really focusing on, which I think is to the detriment actually of both teams in this, largely because, I mean, journalists are interesting as actually both an attacker endpoint, but also actually as a vector, simply because journalists can be interesting because of information that they're sent and that they have, but they can also be interesting because they have large networks of people who are frequently paranoid or take a lot of operational care themselves. And so if you compromise a journalist, then one of the things that can seem very appealing is getting access to their network. I think that the understanding of the sort of the porousness and the dangers of electronic communication has become blindingly clear to everybody in recent times. Um,
Certainly.
but I think together with that, what's also become clear is that we actually sort of have a lot of work to do before we can actually feel sort of safe having, I guess, the types of conversations online that are necessary for a lot of journalists to actually do their jobs.
Okay, and as someone with a lot of experience in digital security, I mean, are you finding media organizations or journalists, coming to you or to your colleagues and saying, "Hey, look, what is this? I've just had this email, or we've had this attack," that they are, reaching out to the security community to learn more?
Yeah, I mean, so I actually get that quite a lot. I do get journalists reaching out to me and saying I've received suspicious emails. Someone's tried to get me to do this, to open this. I've been sent this information, um, which is good because what I actually want to hear is, hey, can you look at this? I've been sent this, not, hey, can you look at this? I've opened this and I think something may have gone wrong. I mean, so it's always good to be sort of looped in that part of the process. Um, I mean, I think that there's definitely sort of greater outreach, and that's great. Um, I think that we're still sort of in an interesting zone where people aren't necessarily um, people have now become quite suspicious, which is useful in some ways, um, but the sort of ability to judge what's safe and what's not online, I think, is still very difficult. And especially as journalists, you're in an interesting position because you receive a lot of communication from people that you don't know. And
Mm.
so when you receive something from someone promising to be interesting or important, I've attached this document, um, then obviously this puts you in an interesting position because I think a lot of the sort of existing security training and sort of prevailing security wisdom is never to open attachments from people you don't know, like et cetera, et cetera. Um, which obviously puts like a journalist in an interesting position who's sort of a part of the job is to actually sort of filter and process communications from people that they have little basis for trust with. So yeah, I mean, I actually do get quite a few inquiries from journalists like, is this safe? I've been sent this. Is this mail safe? Which I actually think is a really positive sign because it shows that people are sort of thinking in the right space.
Yeah, you're making an interesting point there that very much so, journalists, we are reaching out to our audiences more and more and saying, please send us stuff, and we're using content from the audience much more, which I suppose does come with potentially added risks. If you've just joined us, we've got Morgan Marquis-Boire, a security expert, to talk about the threat of cyber attacks and hacking upon journalists. Morgan, you've got some slides to show us, I guess, to explain more clearly some of the threats that journalists might find themselves facing. Let's start sharing your screen. And for those of you who might not know how this is working, we'll get Morgan to start sharing his screen, and you'll be able to actually make that shared screen larger on your own computer, and you can toggle the button that says full screen, and you can minimize that as you like. So Morgan, over to you. If you start sharing your screen, and if you could just kindly remember that when you're using the cursor, just to take it a little bit slower, and then everyone should be able to follow along quite well. So over to you.
Sure. Sure thing. So what I've done here is I've just created a short slide deck. So I was thinking this session might be more valuable if it was interactive. If people could ask me questions, but I think it might be useful to speak to a few points first. So let me
Absolutely.
get this started. Um,
I'm going to turn my camera off so they can focus directly on you. I'm not popping away for a coffee, but I'll be still here.
it's still not. Let me try this one more time. The glories of Adobe software.
Well,
Okay,
perhaps when we're speaking about Adobe,
here
we
we
shouldn't
go.
be. Okay, over to you.
Can everyone see this? Does it look good?
Looking good from here so
Um,
far.
okay, excellent. So what I'm actually going to talk about is a type of digital campaign which is commonly waged against individuals, which one could describe as sort of targeted surveillance. And this frequently takes the form of installing an implant on a target's computer. Um, a common method of targeting people is by what we commonly describe as phishing. Um, and so this involves sending a target some form of digital communication via, you know, primarily email, but potentially via chat or Skype or something like that, where you try to persuade the target by means of social engineering to install an attachment or click on a link to a malicious website or something like this. Um, now, the the real world relevance of this has been thrown into sharp relief over the last year, and that we've seen things which I think have made us really understand the effects of this. As I mentioned before, journalists are a very interesting target, as are news organizations, um, because they frequently have great contacts and traditionally reasonably poor operational security procedures. Um, the About 3, 4 years ago, the sort of tech community got a big wake up when we saw a variety of organizations were compromised and spied upon by the Chinese government. Um, and we've sort of seen a slow but steady improvement in the sort of security posture of a lot of these types of organizations. Um, this year, we actually saw a bunch of things like this. In January, the New York Times came out um, suggesting that. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you. Yep.
Oh, sorry, I'm getting a little pop-up saying. So in January this year, the New York Times released an article talking about how they had been repeatedly compromised by the Chinese government. So it seemed that Chinese hackers had broken into the organization several times, um, probably to enumerate sources, gain access to communications, and that type of thing. The New York Times wasn't by any means alone in this. Um, as it came out, the Washington Post, days after, revealed that they had actually also been compromised by Chinese hackers. Um, and again, these were by no means solely the two US news organizations. In fact, this is actually sort of part of a much wider trend. Um, I'd like to talk a little bit about a case study of a smaller group of citizen journalists that I actually helped personally. And this will sort of give you an idea of the type of actors playing in this space, how they operate, the types of tools that they use, and the types of effects these attacks can have. So Memphis is a citizen journalist organization, citizen media portal from Morocco. And they rose to prominence, um, producing, I guess, what one could describe as somewhat critical material of the Moroccan government's practices at the time. They were given a free expression award online by Google, Global Voices, and gave them an award. But very shortly after this, they actually received some digital messages which weren't exactly designed to congratulate them. And this is an example of what I mentioned before, how it's the job of journalists to actually receive external communications promising titillating or tantalizing material. So they're in their, tell us about Scoops kind of page, someone sent them this message which said, please don't mention me. I don't want to get involved in any trouble, but go to this document which is called Scandal. And what was interesting about this document is that downloading it and executing it would actually it was actually a malicious document which exploited Microsoft Office, and it downloaded a backdoor. This backdoor was a multi-platform backdoor. It would work on Windows, it would work on Mac OS X, it would work on BlackBerry.
Morgan, what's a backdoor? Can I ask?
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
And so this malicious piece of software provided a bunch of sort of robust functionality. Now, I'm listing the sort of capabilities here. Essentially what this is that it's malicious code which resides on your computer. And now this code would do everything from logging your keystrokes, monitoring your communications. It could turn on your microphone and record the audio happening in the area around the computer. It could turn on your webcam, watch you through the webcam, record Skype conversations, take screenshots of the desktop. I mean, this is a fairly full featured piece of software. And I think at this point it's actually useful when we talk about backdoors and this type of thing. It's frequently discussed as malware, which I think gives some people sort of, we harken back to the days where we talked about viruses, and this was something that was really inconvenient to sort of get on your computer. And you might have to run antivirus and try to get rid of it. It's more useful to think of this actually as taking the form of targeted surveillance, right? Frequently, this type of software is commercially produced. It's sold as a surveillance solution. It's supported. People get training in how to use it. This particular software that was used, it looked like it was used by the Moroccan government to target this organization. Analysis of the software itself showed that it was, very good. I think we've just exited. Analysis of the software itself showed that it was actually written by an Italian company known as Hacking Team. Hacking Team sells commercial-grade spyware. They claim to sell it only to government, intelligence community, and law enforcement. And they sort of pitch themselves as providing intercept capability for the security-aware, geographically mobile target. And one of the reasons why they provide this is actually simply because sort of people are becoming sort of more aware of security, and so they're using encrypted communications and that type of thing. And so, how do you get at the communications of a target that is trying to practice good security procedures, that's using encrypted communications and so forth? Well, you hack them and you install this implant on their computer. And as you can see, this gives you access to a whole plethora of recording options of their communications.
That's quite extraordinary, Morgan. I mean, that's basically every sort of communication aspect of the of your computer or device.
But wait, it gets even more distressing. What's interesting is that for the sort of the commercial platforms from this, I think we've traditionally thought about this type of implant or this type of backdoor or malware as something that actually happens to our laptop or desktop computers. Now, I mean, as journalists, especially as people who are quite mobile, will know, sort of a lot of work happens these days on tablets, on mobile devices, and we've actually seen a corresponding rise in the type of surveillance solution that's actually provided for these types of platforms. There was one that I looked at recently that was cross-platform, and that it had there were implants for Apple devices, Android, BlackBerry, Symbian, Windows Mobile. And the spyware, I found this incredibly creepy in that it provided call interception, logging of phone calls, interception of SMS messages, location tracking, which we've heard quite a lot about in the last couple of days, steal your address book, and a feature that I found especially creepy was invisible microphone. And what was interesting is when you actually disassembled the backdoor, it was actually in the code itself, it was actually listed as spy call functionality. And what this would actually do is there would be a persistent outbound call from your phone to a remote number. And so basically it's acting as a constant bug wherever you are, just listening to what you're saying, listening to what people around you are saying. When an incoming call would come in, call waiting would be activated and it would return control of the hardware to your phone. So your phone would vibrate, lights would flash, that sort of thing. You could answer your phone to your phone call, but when you exit your phone call, the spy call would reopen. And again, you just have this persistent outbound connection to the remote actor that had compromised your device. So yeah, I mean,
Would your mobile phone company have any idea that that was happening to your device?
I mean, not explicitly. Like, obviously, if someone looked at your phone records, then they could probably note that you had like a continuous outbound call going. I mean, it's. I mean, depending on for instance, I mean, think of it as like a bug, right? Like, how long is someone bugging you? It would probably be noticeable if someone did this for all the time because it would reduce your phone battery capabilities to like 2 hours or something, right? So you would probably do this specifically to hear certain conversations and so forth. So it wouldn't be explicitly visible to your phone carrier, no. Um,
Question about the backdoor. I mean, how is it delivered and how might you recognize it?
right. So as I mentioned before, I mean, what actually happened here is that the Mamfakinch people were persuaded to download a document which promised a scandalous story. Um, Frequently, people are sent documents sort of pertaining to their area of interest, right? Like, I mean, you could send someone a document saying, for instance, "Hi Morgan, we would like you to participate in this Deutsche Welle Security Week. Please open this document in order to, please open and fill in this document." Um, Right, and I mean, there's a sort of a variety of ways to persuade someone to open a malicious document or visit a malicious website. Understanding of your target is actually very key. For instance, in the Syrian conflict, I saw what I thought was a particularly clever example of this when people were passing around, people were sending members of the opposition malicious backdoors, which promised to be a plan for the foundation of the Syrian High Council post-revolution. And it was actually sort of like a 20-page document. It actually looked very interesting and very legitimate. But in addition to providing this document, it also installed a backdoor which would record your keystrokes and send information about your Skype conversations to a remote actor in Damascus. So in a lot of ways, the method of targeting is frequently involves some form of intel gathering on the target and then performing some form of social engineering on them in an attempt to trick them into either opening a malicious file, installing malicious software, or one of the things that we've seen more prevalent recently is attempting to get people to go to a compromised site, which will serve an exploit frequently in Flash or Java, which is software designed to sort of facilitate a rich internet experience. I mean, we're using Flash right now to perform this, via Adobe Connect to perform this sort of remote connection sharing. And so, I mean, I've seen websites that provide popular community resources. An interesting one was that I saw recently was SyrianMartyrs.com, which was a website which kept track of the war dead in Syria, which is obviously useful to anyone reporting on the Syrian conflict. This site was compromised and used to actually serve this type of exploit. So if someone visited the site and they had Java enabled in their browser, it would automatically install this type of implant onto their system. So I mean, there's a few methods of delivery, but I mean, these are sort of common ones, and how this is commonly used to install on targets.
Okay.
Um, so this is this is sort of no longer the realm, if it ever truly was, of sort of hackers and hobbyists and sort of a virus community. And it's no longer simply the realm either of, if it ever was simple, of an international intelligence, a shadowy sort of intelligence community that we didn't know much about, but that we sort of always assumed had sort of boutique capability to create their own malware and perform their own sort of computer network exploitation operations. Um, Now what we actually see is the sort of the commercialization of the threat landscape. We've seen a rise in sort of a middle tier of actors that are selling this type of capability to countries commercially. So it's always been assumed that certain major actors, probably the US, Russia, China, Israel, France, the UK, and so forth, had the capability to develop their own tools in this area. Um, a lot of other countries have historically not spent a lot of resource developing these, but these tools have become very desirable. And where there's desire, there's market. And what we see is stuff like what's on the screen in front of you. ISS World is an international conference. As you can see, it's sort of held around the world, Europe, Middle East, Asia, uh, North and South America. And it's a conference providing intelligence support systems for lawful interception, criminal investigations, and intelligence gathering, otherwise known as the Wiretappers Ball. Um, and at this conference, vendors actually sell. I mean, they get together to pitch and sell offensive cyber capability for the purposes of doing precisely what we've just described. In fact, the type of tool that I was just talking about, written by Hacking Team, they are a frequent attendee and sort of sales presence at these types of conferences. People also sell this type of capability at arms fairs around the world. It's sold in the same breath as the types of surveillance solutions that we're sort of more familiar with.
Yes, we had Holger Gero yesterday from Reporters Without Borders Germany, who gave us quite a good insight on particularly some of the European companies who are producing, I mean, what many say are digital arms.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting metaphor to use. It's certainly convenient in some ways. I mean, people talk a lot about sort of Finn Fisher, Vupen, Hacking Team, um, because they sell, I guess, what a prima facie offensive capabilities, and then you have sort of other actors like sort of the French DPI, sort of deep packet inspection vendor, Amicis, who got caught selling gear that could be used for mass surveillance to Libya. Um, I'm I find the digital arms metaphor a little bit uncomfortable in some ways, simply because I these tools provide sort of targeted surveillance capability. Um, so obviously conflating them with something like, say, Stuxnet, which provided kinetic destructive capability. I'd like people to sort of really separate this, because
Hmm.
that I guess they sort of suggest different types of actions. For instance, I think that backdooring someone's computer is an act of espionage, an act of spycraft. But when we sort of talk about digital arms, in some ways, this creates this conflation with kinetic capability and actual physical warfare, which
Hmm.
which I'm less comfortable with. Although that's sort of more of a personal standpoint.
Sure.
So the the effects of this type of intrusion on an organization um, can be sort of manifold. Dealing with the realities of government surveillance is actually really depressing, and it's really scary. From talking with members of Manficage, they've discussed with me and publicly the chilling effect that sort of this type of government surveillance played on their organization. People were very scared. Um, um, you also become scared for the safety of your sources. Um, and it's sort of I think it's very difficult to deal with. Um, and we'll talk a little bit earlier about how sort of understanding of this type of threat prior to it happening to you is kind of really the way forward. I think we should probably, now's a good time to sort of open things up for questions, I think. Um,
Yes. Do we have
I'll come back to that.
questions? Do we have some questions from anyone on what Morgan has shared with us so far?
I mean, I have a few more examples that I'll get to later and sort of advice for people. But in some ways, I think I've probably sort of covered kind of a bunch of material that, we probably have different levels of knowledge on this area in the audience. So if people would like me to recapitulate things or,
Yeah,
sort of dig down deeper.
I think certainly on what the effects it has on journalists is something which has come up a number of times this week, that it erodes trust that sources might have in journalists if they can't trust us because they fear that we are under surveillance and can't trust us with passing on important information.
Well, yeah, I mean, I people frequently use that phrase "chilling effect," right? And this is probably the one of the easiest side effects, right? Like the phrase commonly used, the most effective form of censorship happens, between one's mind and the keyboard. When you can persuade people to self-censor, then that's kind of like a really big win
Mm.
for sort of authoritarian structures. Um, and so, when you become increasingly paranoid about the security of your digital communications, it it reduces those sort of urges to speak out, the urges to contact journalists, um, and then that works both ways. Like I've talked to journalists who have been contacted by a source with sort of potentially interesting information, and this has sort of happened very recently, and they've become very concerned that they don't have the tools or know-how to safely conduct um, communications with the source in a manner that will actually protect them, that they actually feel is professionally sound to them. And so that may lead to them feeling that they actually need to pass on a story, that they can't report on certain areas without putting either the people that their sources in danger or themselves. Um, so I mean, this is the sort of effects of this type of thing are obviously broader um, than what might seem most immediate, which is the actual compromise of a device leading to that kind of direct surveillance and compromise of your communications and networks.
Morgan, we've got a question coming in regarding knowing, I think referring there, knowing in an email or a link that might be intended to hack, especially if the email is coming from a known contact. I mean, I think what perhaps some of our participants are going to be very, very keen to know, firstly, what are some of the more common types of attacks that they may encounter, and then I suppose, like Jake is asking here, tips on what to do when you when you see that. So perhaps another element to this is understanding some of the telltale signs, if possible, to identify, and what you can do from that.
Yeah. So I'm gonna talk about perhaps precautions that one can take a little bit towards the end.
Hmm.
Just sort of end on a positive and hopeful note because this is all very depressing, this sort of subject.
Indeed.
But
Empower us,
but
Morgan. Empower us, please.
right, we live in hope, or we try to. Um, so the, I mean, stuff. So a malicious communication coming from a trusted contact. you're actually in this sort of a sort of a good and good and bad situations here. Um, the the good side of things is that you're actually likely to know. I mean, and there's sort of multiple ways this can come in. Actually, let's discuss that first. So obviously, someone can sort of fake or spoof email, which pretends to be from a legitimate source. You know, like I received something from Guy Deegan being like, "Hey Morgan, we've actually decided that your presentation was so fantastic, we're going to give you $1 million. You just need to open this PDF and then sign it and send it back to us." So like, oh, well, that's very nice of them, and I am entitled and deserving, and so therefore I'm going to open this document. Um, and then obviously what we've seen happen a lot during very active campaigns is we've seen the active compromise of targets sort of via their social networks. So you compromise one person, this gives you the access to their computer, and then you can actually sort of start messaging other contacts of theirs basically as them, and being like, "Hey, I heard that there's a lot of surveillance going around. You should really install this very handy tool which will protect you." Um, so I mean, this is sort of how this can happen. You're in an interesting situation there with someone you know, and that you're actually likely to understand the patterns of their communications, and so it makes it easier for you to pick what might actually be suspicious. However, you're probably more likely to sort of blind trust them. Um, I would I would actually, as a rule, I'm personally very inclined not to install random software that's recommended to me um, by anyone by unsolicited communication. um,
Okay.
I generally don't do that. I think with documents, the PDFs, with Word docs and that sort of thing, um, I actually tend to open all of those in the cloud. Now, obviously, this isn't not necessarily going to work for everybody. Obviously, if you're a lawyer, if you have legal concerns, um, obviously, depending on the country you're in, and you might have concerns about your cloud provider and local intercept. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can play into this. If you're in a position where you can trust a cloud provider, though, then, for instance, I like to upload my things that I find suspicious if I'm going to try to read them into Google Docs or something like that, right? Because then the document opens in a sandbox. I'm not opening it on my computer, and if it doesn't render, then there's well, I probably shouldn't be opening that kind of thing going on. So you can sort of
Okay.
remove
So,
yourself
so
from.
if you had just an average Google account and something what as simple as like right click open with and select a cloud type of service, that's as a first step something much more safer to do.
Oh, well, I mean, yeah. I mean, I guess getting a service to open documents for you is safer in one aspect than opening them on your own computer. Obviously, as I said again, that solution may not work for everybody. It particularly doesn't work for, say, lawyers, right? Because if you're receiving legal documentation, perhaps it is actually professionally unsound for you to upload this to a remote service, and um, so obviously you have to weigh up. But there's those types of options. That are sort of available to you. Um, I, I,
I'm not
you know,
sure.
I
I'm not sure if you can see that. There's also a related question here to that about companies like Kaspersky, antiviral types of software. You know, what's your opinion about that?
so antivirus is actually very good at detecting attacks that have been seen before, which is that's the strength of antivirus. Unfortunately, it's very bad at detecting attacks that people have not seen or have been modified in some way. Um, which actually means that if someone is targeting you specifically, they're likely to have made sure that um, their tools do not set off antivirus alerts first. which is why antivirus is actually pretty good at protecting you from the type of crimeware that's going to steal your World of Warcraft password, but has traditionally not been as strong against the types of targeted attacks that we're discussing today. Um, the question says, I'm going to read this out. So, what do I think of the work of companies like Kaspersky? They pretend to give us security against virus attacks and things like that. Is it useless to buy their products? No, I think it's definitely worthwhile to run antivirus. It's sort of part of, I would not rely upon it. But so people say things about sort of like a false sense of security. The security community actually has a phrase which is defense in depth, right? And what that actually means is using sort of a variety of security solutions and procedures to try to protect yourself. It's like using suspenders and a belt to hold up your pants, right?
Right.
If one of these things breaks, you're still wearing the pants, which is, probably what most people want. Um, so I mean, antivirus can definitely sort of play a part in your security solution. I would recommend that people use it. Um, there's a variety of stuff out there, and I don't feel strongly about any particular antivirus solution. Miko Hippinen from F-Secure has stated categorically that he does not give any type of government spyware a pass, nor will he ever. That sort of posture could be appealing to a lot of people. Um, so yeah, is there?
We also have a question there about, talk about cloud services as well that you mentioned before, Dropbox. Is it okay to upload documents? I think it's probably suspicious documents to Dropbox and open them there.
I mean, I can't speak specifically to Dropbox's service. If Dropbox opens documents for you, and you're not concerned about the fact that they now exist in Dropbox's cloud, that's a fine thing to do. Um, I mean, there's also a variety of services that attempt to figure out if something is malicious or not. You can use VirusTotal. I'll type that into the
Yes,
chat.
please.
So let's see. It's like www.virustotal.com. And so say you receive malicious attachments. You can VirusTotal is a site that you can upload them to, and it will run whatever file you upload through, I believe at the moment, it's like 45 different antivirus solutions. So this is obviously not a foolproof method of discovering something is malicious, but it's actually a good way of seeing whether or not it's something malicious that the antivirus industry knows about. Like, I mean, again, this is sort of another thing that you can do that's kind of useful. There's a few sort of, if you're feeling, a little bit more technically inclined and you sort of want to do more digging, there's a website which I think is called malware.com. I think it's .com. And this will actually, you have to be slightly technically inclined to use this site. But for instance, this website will actually run malicious files for you. And you can look to see if they sort of make network connections to places that you find suspicious or that type of thing. Obviously, you'd actually have to be technically adroit enough to parse the results. And so this might not be for everybody. It's just sort of steps down the line. There's, a thing you can do.
What about at the most basic level? I mean, if you're seeing something that has a URL address or some sort of indicator like that, a link. I mean, I would look at something and say, well, do I recognize that web address? Does that sort of look legitimate? But are attacks able to disguise whatever they're trying to send you in a URL that looks safe? Is that possible?
Sure. That actually happens a bunch. I think now actually might be a good time to sort of revisit the last few slides that I've got. So I'm going to kind of cover that and actually I'll have some sort of suggestions for people.
Please,
Uh,
I think a lot of people would like to have sort of like I guess that sort of basic action plan, knowing some steps. We've got 15 minutes to go,
yeah,
yeah, I think that
we'll
should
go
make
quickly. We'll still have some time for questions.
good stuff. Okay, yeah, if we leave some time for questions, I'm sure that'll be appreciated from everyone.
All right, let's see. Um, okay, how are we doing? Excellent. So I'm going to just give a few more examples of sort of organizations from large to smaller that have actually been compromised by these types of attacks and things that I've seen. So there's a very large media organization that received a fake questionnaire from what looked to be a Beijing news office. And it had a whole bunch of information. It looked to be a questionnaire about what sort of information news organizations might like to receive about upcoming elections in China. And this document was actually malware. It was actually Chinese malware. And I looked at it for this organization, and I asked them, I was like, this is actually quite bad. Did anyone in your organization open it? And they said, well, actually about 10 people had received it, and actually that all opened it. And that actually believed that because the organization had strict policies of running antivirus, that they would be protected from these types of attacks. Unfortunately, this was not true for them. So they had a messy and expensive cleanup effort. I've seen a national newspaper, and they were sort of actively compromised by the types of tools that I was actually discussing earlier. The tools had to have been used by the government of the country that they were in. The tools looked to have been sold by a European vendor. And at the time, they were actively under compromise. They actually never went public with this because they were actually sort of very worried about the effects of exposing government spying in the country that they were subject to its laws, and what the government could actually do. More recently, I actually helped out a journalist who had been the target of these types of attacks. And what was interesting was that he messaged me and he said, Morgan, I've received what I think is a suspicious email. He had very good eyes. He was very skeptical. And his university background was public. He is a prominent journalist. You could read a lot about his background. And he had received an email which looked to be from his former university advising him that there was some type of alumnus event. And he had a PDF attachment. And so I saw this and I was like, aha. And so I spent a little while pulling apart this PDF. And to my frustration, this PDF appeared to all intents and purposes to be legitimate. And I was like, could this actually be a legitimate communication? This is very strange. I mean, maybe it is. And then I actually read through the PDF, and the website that the PDF attempted to get him to sign up to an event at the university, and the remote website was actually a malicious link. It looked to be fine, but in actuality, it sent him past a website which attempted to steal credentials for his email and other online communications. So when we sort of try to think about defending ourselves against these types of attacks, a lot of people like to give very, very tool-based advice and very technical sort of advice. They say things like, we'd really want you to use antivirus, you should be using personal firewalls, you should be using Tor, you should be using VPNs, and all of these things are probably a good idea. I think security, though, is not a tool that you install. It's something it's a procedure actually that you follow, and it's a process, and it's something that you're actually engaged with constantly as opposed to sort of a one-time thing. But the useful thing here is that you actually know more about this than you think. First off, the first step is actually kind of thinking about your security posture. Chances are you actually know what you're trying to protect. You know, I mean, it is not always true, but most of the time you actually understand what you have that's valuable, the sources that you have that are very interesting, that are in danger or might be exposed, the documents you have that are very sensitive. And you actually probably already understand who might actually try to come after you because of this. There's a little bit of time thinking about what your exposure is and what the likely outcomes are. And then you can actually sort of tailor your operational security posture to fit this. And that actually involves, perhaps things as simple as not keeping certain types of data on your computer. If you don't trust certain communication mechanisms, don't discuss sensitive topics over them. If you know something is sensitive, actually seek the help of someone that can help you set up a secure communications channel. There's a lot of this. A lot of this stems from this really basic primitive of actually understanding what you have, what you need to protect, and who you think might come after you. Because once you've become compromised, you've compromised basically everyone who trusts you. So that's kind of your social network. And a lot of the sort of protective steps you can take don't really work retroactively, right? Like once you've already been compromised, things become messy and problematic. It's actually really good to take these precautions ahead of time. And so, I mean, we've talked a lot about people that have, the types of compromises that have occurred, the types of organizations, and that sort of thing. As a final sort of thing, I mean, this is a very practical, real-world example of someone who I hope people have heard of, who his name was Sean McAllister, and he actually got a bunch of contacts in Syria in trouble, and that he went there as a documentary filmmaker, and he actually had all of his digital devices and communications seized, which actually led to the compromise and unraveling of his network of contacts that was sort of very, very sensitive at the time. So I mean, there's sort of very real-world examples of the type of things that can happen. I'm going to come back here. All right. All right. Can everyone?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so we've sort of got a few minutes left. I think sort of 5 minutes for sort of questions and that sort of thing.
Yeah, please. If you've got questions for Morgan, do fire away. Maybe while we're waiting for a couple to come in, with applications. Oh, actually, here's a simple one. What about passwords, Morgan? Getting a strong password. What's your thoughts on that?
So chances are your password is bad. You should. I recommend that people use password safes. There's a variety of free ones for Windows, OS X, ones that will work on your phone. I don't recommend storing all your passwords on your phone. But these password safes kind of facilitate you being able to remember very long passwords. I mean, the common wisdom when it comes to authentication, which is sort of what you're doing with a password, you're affirming to a digital resource that you are a certain person, is it's actually kind of good to do the something you have and something you know kind of thing. And so there's been sort of a lot of advances in the use of sort of token-based authentication. A lot of web services now, Gmail, Facebook, Twitter, provide what's known as two-factor authentication. And so what they'll actually do is when you try to log in, you'll enter a password, and then they'll send like a text message or something to a mobile device. And so you'll receive this, and then you'll enter the password in as well. I mean, so that's based on something you know, which is your password, and something you have, which is this mobile device. Now, obviously, if you don't trust your cellular provider, then that's sort of like, well, what if your cellular provider can? And so, some of these things sort of provide software which runs on a device, which will provide what's known as a one-time password. So you enter your password, and then it will say, please enter these numbers given to you by the software in your device. And these types of solutions are a lot more robust than simply having a sort of traditional password that you remember.
Okay, and I mean, as you might have mentioned before, I mean, open source is better to pursue with that, or are there some commercial off-the-shelf ones that are also worth looking
Well,
at?
so with what? With the password safes or with
Yeah, with the password safes.
um, yeah, there's free stuff that's fine. And there's things like OnePass and I mean, if you type in sort of password safe, if you
Mm.
type in the words password safe and free password safe and then your operating system, free password safe Linux, free password safe OS X, free password safe Windows, you'll probably find stuff. They're actually also really quite cheap as software goes, from what I remember, like sort of $20 type of thing, as opposed to, so they're sort of reasonably easy to acquire.
Okay, maybe our participants too might have some ideas on ones that have worked quite well for them, and can share their experience in the chat room. Do we have any other questions for Morgan?
Yeah, so I mean, we've sort of got a couple of minutes left. Um, I know that a lot of this topic can seem sort of depressing and intimidating. And in fact, I had a very interesting experience with a guy at the Surveillance and Human Rights Summit, and he was a human rights activist, and he was also a lawyer. And what he actually sort of said to me is, he was like, "Oh, I hear a lot of this stuff, but I'm not particularly technical, and it's all very worrying." And so there's this kind of, you know, you sort of distance yourself. It's sort of natural, I think, to distance oneself from sources of extreme worry and paranoia. Um, and I would encourage people, if there's one thing that I could do, I would encourage people not to be security nihilists, not to be
Hmm.
privacy nihilists. Um, we talk a lot in the security community about raising the bar,
Hmm.
increasing the difficulty for attackers and that type of thing. Um, and in some ways, this is a little fatalistic, but are you familiar with the running from the bear metaphor? Um,
Well, maybe explain that to us
so,
a
so,
bit
so
better.
the joke is that you don't have to run faster than the bear. You just need to run faster than your other friends that are running from the bear.
Right.
Um, right. But what this actually means, though, is that um, attackers will frequently leave targets that are more difficult alone,
Hmm.
in favor of softer targets. Um, and when we also talk about raising the bar for attackers, it's the same type of thing. Simply because you actually feel that it's like, oh, well, it sounds like there's a lot of really sophisticated methods that an attacker could use to compromise me, um, doesn't actually mean that you um, shouldn't actually employ all of the basic security recommendations that people come up with, because a lot of them are actually incredibly efficacious um, at actually sort of preventing those compromises. So, I mean, keep a clear head about things.
Hmm.
Use the most up-to-date software that you can. That's actually really key. Use the latest version of operating systems. Use the latest version of your mobile operating system. A lot of security engineering goes into. Don't use like something like Windows XP is the worst thing that people can do, right? That's like a 12-year-old operating system or something. If you're going to use Windows, use Windows 8.1 or whatever the latest is, right? Then you
Yeah.
actually get the advantages of the last 12 years of security engineering.
So
Um,
stay very much up to date.
I mean, that's probably the most simple piece of advice that I can give people is use the most up-to-date software that you can, and you'll actually sort of get the benefit of all that in the back of the last 10 years of security experience that people have actually had. For instance, I mean, even yeah, sorry.
Morgan, just I mean, we're going a little bit over time, but I think there is a good question there, which Stefan has pointed out, that's come from the blog. How can you check that your digital security tools are actually working? I mean, I think that's quite a broad question because there are so many. But if you've got some tips on that to maybe finally conclude, that would be good.
Right. So obviously there's some types of tools that have built-in checks. So for instance, something like Tor. For instance, there's generally, like, if you use Tor browser, it will tell you if Tor is working, right? Which is fantastic. So it provides that type of feedback loop. With other types of software, for instance, frequently like antivirus, you don't know if it's working unless it's actually catching viruses. And now so you're like, wait, does that mean I have no viruses? Does that mean this is not working? Like, I don't really know. There's no real short answer to this because obviously it's very tool dependent and tools do a lot of different things. What you've touched on, though, is actually a core problem of digital security in that a lot of people are told to install this stuff, install this software, follow these procedures, and you don't know whether or not that they're working, right? I would advise people in many ways to think of this like brushing their teeth, practicing good digital hygiene, right? Like, I mean, on a day-to-day basis, you may not know whether brushing your teeth is working. After a long time, if you're really slack about this and you engage in eating a lot of high-risk foods, the chances that something bad is going to happen is, it's there. So I'm not sure if that analogy stretches.
No, I think it's very apt. Very apt. I think that's where we'll leave it for today. Morgan Marquis-Boire, thank you very much for getting up early to speak with us today. We very much appreciate that. It's been a fascinating discussion with you.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. Stay safe on the internet.
Morgan, you can follow Morgan on Twitter, and there is a link to his Twitter handle from our website. A video of this live session will also be made available later tonight, and that'll be posted on the website. Don't forget that DW Academy, we have our On Media blog, which we're very much have a good focus on digital safety and security for journalists. That is a particular focus for us, so you can always find useful resources there. We thank you to everyone for participating in this workshop, and if you've been visiting us for or tuning in for the previous workshops, we very much appreciate your participation, and we hope you've enjoyed them and learned something. The whole series has been a production, of course, by the Deutsche Welle Academy, and here from the team, our thanks to Peter Bruckner and Thomas Bakajcek for their technical expertise for the live video training sessions. On the website, our digital safety website, thanks to Katrin Berghoff and to our editors, Kyle James and Kate Hairsign, for the fantastic content that they have produced. The concept and series was developed and produced by Stefan Leidl and Holger Hunk at DW Academy Digital. We look forward to you joining us again in the future for more online tutorials. But for now, it's goodbye from Berlin. Thank you. Morgan, from us, thank you very, very much.
All right, my pleasure. Take it easy, and have a great weekend.
We'd very much like to stay in touch with you, and you have a good weekend yourself, and a good day at work. Bye for now.
All right, see you later.